I was 96 years old when I finally forgave my father, and by then he had been in the ground for nearly 30 years. My name is Edward Callahan. I'm 96, and for most of my life I told myself I had made peace with the man who raised me. The truth is, I had only learned how to live around the anger. When people reach my age, they expect you to talk about wars or lost loves or the secret to a long marriage. They don't expect you to admit that you spent 70 years misunderstanding your own father. But that is the weight I carried, quietly, like an old coat I refused to throw away. My father was not a cruel man, at least not in the way people usually mean. He never drank, never gambled, never raised a hand to my mother. He worked. That is what he did. He worked before the sun came up and came home after it went down. He spoke little. He demanded much. And he believed that love was proven by providing, not by speaking. As a boy, I did not understand that language. What I understood was the sound of his boots on the wooden floor when he came home, the way the house seemed to stiffen when he stepped inside. I understood the way my mother straightened her apron and the way I put away whatever childish thing I was doing. I understood that mistakes were not to be explained, only corrected. He rarely praised me. When I brought home good grades, he nodded. When I struck out in baseball, he said, "Practice more." When I told him I wanted to draw, he told me drawing would not feed a family. It wasn't said with cruelty. It was said like a fact, like winter. I grew up believing that I was never quite enough for him. When I was 17, I told him I wanted to attend college out of state. He stared at me for a long time, then asked who would help my mother while he worked. I heard only control in that question. I did not hear fear or exhaustion or responsibility. So I stayed. I took a job at the same factory where he had worked since he was a young man. Every morning, we rode together in silence. That silence became the shape of our relationship. I married at 24. On my wedding day, he shook my hand. Not hugged me, shook my hand. I remember feeling embarrassed by him. Embarrassed by his stiffness, by his inability to say what other fathers seemed to say so easily. I told myself that when I had children, I would be different. And I was, at least on the surface. I said I love you often. I attended school plays. I learned to clap loudly. But I also worked long hours. I carried stress home with me. I corrected more than I encouraged. I did not see the resemblance. My father grew older in the background of my life. He retired quietly. My mother passed first, and after that he seemed to shrink, as if part of his structure had been removed. I visited out of duty more than desire. Our conversations never went far beyond the weather, the price of groceries, the condition of my car. There were things I wanted to ask him. Why were you always so hard on me? Did you ever feel proud? Did you ever want something different for yourself? But the questions felt dangerous, like stepping onto thin ice. So I never asked them. He died in his late 60s, a heart that had worked as steadily as his hands finally giving out. At the funeral, people spoke about his reliability, his steadiness, his sacrifice. I stood there feeling a complicated grief, one part sadness and one part unfinished business. I cried, but even in my tears there was distance. After we buried him, I helped clear out his small house. Most of it was ordinary, worn shirts, tools neatly arranged, bills stacked carefully in drawers. My sister took the kitchen things. I handled the garage and the bedroom. In the back of his closet was a metal box I had never seen before. It was locked, but the key was taped underneath, as if he wanted it found. I I sat on the edge of his bed, a bed that looked too small without him in it, and opened the box. Inside were papers, old envelopes, and a stack of letters tied together with string. The top letter had my name on it, written in his careful handwriting. My first thought was confusion. My second was irritation. Why write letters you never sent? I untied the string and began to read. The first letter was dated the year I turned 10. He wrote about how he had watched me sleep after I had a fever, how he had been afraid in a way he could not explain, how he realized that night that loving a child meant accepting a constant vulnerability. He wrote that he wished he knew how to talk to me without sounding harsh, but that his own father had only known discipline, not tenderness. He ended the letter by saying he hoped I would forgive him for the ways he fell short. My hands shook as I read. There were more letters. One from when I struck out in that baseball game, saying he saw the disappointment on my face and wanted to tell me he admired my courage for trying, but the words stuck in his throat. One from the week before my wedding, confessing that he practiced what to say in front of the mirror and still felt foolish. One written after my first child was born, admitting that he feared I would now see all his mistakes clearly. These letters were not polished. They were awkward, repetitive, sometimes painfully simple. But they were honest, in a way I had never experienced from him in person. And then there was one dated the year I told him I wanted to leave for college. He wrote that he lay awake that night calculating bills, his wages, my mother's medicines, the cost of travel. He wrote that he was ashamed he could not afford to let me go easily. He wrote that asking me to stay felt like stealing something from me, but that he did not know another way to keep the family steady. I had spent decades believing he wanted to control my future. In that small, quiet bedroom, I realized he had been trying to hold the roof up with his bare hands. I do not know why he never gave me those letters. Maybe he thought they would burden me. Maybe he believed actions were enough. Maybe he simply could not bridge the gap between feeling and speaking. Whatever the reason, he carried his softer thoughts alone. I drove home that evening with the box on the seat beside me. I did not turn on the radio. I kept thinking about the young man I had been, so certain of my father's coldness, so unwilling to consider that he might be as frightened and limited as I was. For weeks, I read and reread those letters. Each time, a different memory shifted slightly, like a picture frame being straightened. I remembered the time he stayed up late fixing my broken bicycle, saying nothing when I thanked him. I remembered the way he stood at the edge of the yard when I left for my honeymoon, hands in pockets, watching until the car disappeared. I had interpreted his silence as indifference. Now I wondered how much feeling it had contained. The anger I had carried for so long began to feel heavy and misplaced, like blaming a bridge for being narrow when it was built with limited wood. Forgiveness did not come all at once. It came in layers. First, there was grief for the conversations we never had. Then there was regret for the distance I maintained out of pride. And beneath that, there was a quiet understanding that he had done the best he could with the tools he was given. I visited his grave alone one morning. I brought the letters with me. I sat on the grass, an old man talking to a stone, and I read parts of them out loud. My voice broke in places. I told him I wished we had been braver with each other. I told him I finally saw the effort behind the stern face, and I told him I forgave him. What surprised me most was that in forgiving him, I also felt forgiven. At 96, you spend a lot of time looking backward. The past becomes louder than the future. I have come to believe that many of us misunderstand our parents, not because they did not love us, but because they loved us in a dialect we did not yet know how to translate. If I could sit across from my younger self, the angry young man in the factory parking lot, I would not tell him to ignore his hurt. I would tell him to ask questions sooner. I would tell him that pride can feel like strength, but often acts like a wall. And I would tell him that our parents are not finished products. They are people shaped by their own fears, their own upbringing, their own silent letters. My children are grandparents now. When I watch them with their families, I see traces of myself, and sometimes traces of my father. I try to speak what I feel, even if my voice trembles. I do not want to leave behind unsent letters. If you are listening to me and your father is still alive, I will not tell you to rush out and forgive everything. Some wounds are real and deep, but I will say this: consider the possibility that there are chapters you have not read, burdens you have not seen, sacrifices that were never explained. I waited until I was 96 to understand my father. I wish I had understood him at 16, or 30, or even 60. But life does not always give us clarity on our preferred schedule. All I can do now is carry his letters in a drawer by my bed, and remember that love does not always arrive in the tone we expect. Sometimes it arrives disguised as discipline, as exhaustion, as silence. And sometimes we only recognize it when the voice that carried it is gone.